Meritocracy. It's a word that, at least from this rodent's perspective, has fallen out of favor as of late. For many, it conjures up images of the kids from high school who didn't have a social life because they spent all their time studying, getting straight A's and perfect scores on their SATs, trying to outcompete their peers in the number game that is college admissions. 4 years later in this mental scene, the meritocracy takes the form of a bunch of white, upper-class Harvard graduates rubbing elbows with the rich and powerful on Wall Street, who also happen to be white, upper-class Harvard grads. And in the bleakest, most cynical picture of a meritocracy, the world operates under a Soviet-style technocracy, a system in which only the most intelligent and technically gifted are allowed to have any kind of power or influence. Instead of politicians ruling, you have mathematicians and chemists and engineers. And instead of employers favoring personal skills like ingenuity and ability to collaborate, the top positions are given solely to those who produce the best and the largest output. It's a cold, mechanical system where merit is measured solely by numbers, by the number of hours you put in and the number of widgets you put out. Such a system dominated Soviet life at an institutional level. A significant proportion of the Union's executive committee, called the Politburo, was comprised of engineers, rising as high as 89% by 1986. Soviet leaders held scientific progress and the material output derived from it as nearly paramount values, and workers who overfulfilled their production quotas were treated as national heroes. Take Alexei Stakhanov, for example. The man mined 227 tons of coal in one shift at his factory, was awarded the Order of Lenin and a bunch of other medals, and was given a deputy position by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the highest legislative body in the Union. This inspired workers all over the Union to emulate Stakhanov's productivity and attain the same prestige, a phenomenon known as the shock worker movement. The Soviet Union rewarded impressive credentials, utilitarian skills, and measurable accomplishments. It was a system that we would, in the modern world, call a meritocracy. From the highest state official to the most destitute factory worker, reward was given based solely on the quality of one's work. Nothing more, nothing less. At least, this was the case in most Soviet institutions. After the revolution of 1917 and the Bolsheviks had begun to construct their vision of a perfect classless society, they started to notice that some aspects of Soviet society weren't quite living up to their utopian ideal. For example, in the wake of the Russian Empire's collapse, independence movements in smaller Eastern European countries like the Ukraine threatened to fracture the Union, which would have defeated Karl Marx's vision of a universal communist state in which nationality did not exist as an identity. Thus arose Korenizatsiya, the solution to the nationality problem. Korenizatsiya was a policy of Soviet quote-unquote indigenization, in which Soviet officials promoted members of national ethnic groups to serve in government and bureaucracy on both local and national levels. By doing this, the Soviet Union hoped to become the official champions of ethnic nationalism, thereby co-opting local independence movements and diffusing the sentiments that had spurred them in the first place, dissolving national identity and fostering a single, class-based proletarian identity. This is summarized in Vladimir Lenin's slogan describing the policy: nationalist in form, socialist in content. Indeed, the Union's indigenization policy called for a majority makeup of ethnic minorities in all government institutions, meaning that one's skills were no longer the sole qualification for office. What was more important now were the conditions of one's birth. But why? Is being born a certain way a skill? Do the conditions of one's birth confer any innate skill upon the person who was born that way? Is an ethnic minority inherently better at governing the Soviet Union because he was born in Kazakhstan or Ukraine rather than Russia? The answer to all of these questions should be no. Why, then, do modern institutions all over the world treat race and gender as qualifications for work and higher education? I'm talking, of course, about affirmative action, and for the purposes of this essay, I'm going to focus on affirmative action in college admissions, because it's the form I'm most familiar with and the one that's most relevant to my current situation as a college student myself. My beliefs about affirmative action in higher education expand beyond college admissions and apply across the board in workplace settings as well, and I'm just going to come out right now and say it: I don't think race and gender-based affirmative action is a good thing. Now, I know that there are a lot of good intentions behind affirmative action policies, and if those intentions aligned with observable reality in any way, then I'd be on board with them. But they don't, so I'm not. The one I hear the most often is that affirmative action is meant to give educational opportunities to groups of people who might otherwise not have access to them, and to help them get out of their destitution and create a better life for themselves and their families. Which, on paper, really does sound like a great idea, but when you take a closer look at the principle behind the argument, you already run into something problematic, for lack of a better word. Groups of people. Affirmative action gives educational opportunities to groups of people, which is to imply that groups of people are collectively disadvantaged. Don't see the issue? Allow me to explain. The poster child for affirmative action is the black kid from the inner city who overcame the adversity of poverty, dedicated himself to his studies, and got accepted to a good college. Affirmative action just gives him the financial boost to pay his tuition. But the truth is, that's not how most affirmative action policies work. Of all the factors that played a role in that poster child's life, the one that gets focused on the most is the one that had the least bearing on how he turned out. He came from difficult living conditions, making his success all the more inspirational. He was smart and hardworking, making him a worthy applicant based on academic prowess alone. But what affirmative action policies focus on is that kid's race. Being black didn't make him poor. Being black didn't make him smart. But being black may have been what got him into college. A 2004 Princeton University study found that African Americans have an extra 230 points added to their raw SAT scores. 230 for every African American who took the test. Now, I don't know about you, but giving specific groups of people rewards that they didn't earn through their own efforts sounds like a pretty discriminatory policy if you ask me. The only way that this policy could possibly be justified would be if it were an observable fact that every single African American in the country had the same experience as that poster child, that they all really were disadvantaged in some way, and that they needed a leg up financially. But that's just not the case, I'm sorry. You do realize that there is such a thing as a rich black person, right? There are black people who come from cushy lives and have rich parents and go to private school. They're verifiably in lower numbers than white people who live like this, but they exist. So I want you to imagine this situation. There are two kids applying for the same spot at the same college. One is black, the other is not black. They both have the same grades, same raw SAT scores, same extracurriculars, same interpersonal skills, same family income. Nearly everything about their resumes is identical. The only thing different between these two students is their skin color. In a meritocracy, these students would be given equal consideration at first look, and they have to bring a little something extra to the table for one of them to be admitted. Maybe their interviews reveal something desirable about their character. Maybe one of them is a better speaker or a better writer. But under affirmative action, the scales are tipped in favor of the black kid, who gets a 230-point boost on his raw SAT score and gets the spot, even though someone else was equally deserving of it. It's a hypothetical scenario, and even if probability says it's unlikely to happen, opening up the very possibility of an unjust admissions process like this is reason enough for race-based affirmative action to not exist in the first place. It's why you can't apply policies like these to entire demographics, because invariably, certain individuals don't fit the narrative of the disadvantaged, oppressed minority, and you wind up with loopholes in the policy like the one I just described. Being black isn't in itself a disadvantage, nor is it a qualification. There are people who think otherwise, and we call those people racists. To believe that race determines behavior or ability is literally the definition of racism, and yet it seems that it's the people who claim to be fighting against racism who think in this way. It's also this mentality that leads to the second intention behind affirmative action. That by fostering an environment of racial diversity, you foster an environment of intellectual diversity. Students of different ethnic backgrounds will bring different life experiences to the school, and students can learn from each other in ways that they wouldn't be able to in a racially homogeneous setting. After all, if two people have different skin colors, they must have different life experiences, right? No! What utter nonsense! The idea that one's personality and perspective are determined by race? Again, that's literally the definition of racism. It suggests that there's a common perspective shared by all black people, or all white people, or all Asian people, or all Hispanic people. And certainly there might be cultural commonalities among different ethnic groups, but like I said before, a black kid and a white kid might come from the same insular, privileged upbringing, or the same impoverished hellhole. And by assuming that every black kid and every white kid have fundamentally different life experiences, administrators reveal this policy for what it really is. It paints ethnic groups with one broad brush, and no matter which way you try to look at it, it makes some pretty heinous presuppositions about the minorities it tries to benefit. By awarding extra points on tests, you imply that all African Americans are either too disadvantaged or too stupid to succeed on their own merit. It's called the bigotry of low expectations. By targeting different demographics for the sake of intellectual diversity, you imply a universal experience or hive mind mentality for those demographics, which reeks of racial determinism. When it comes to being admitted to college or being accepted for a job when you're out of college, it shouldn't matter what you are, it should only matter what you do or what you have the potential to do, and if you're not qualified, then you shouldn't get the job, plain and simple. Now already I know my argument has raised some red flags in the minds of those who don't understand what I'm saying. But reality, Weasel, are you saying that ethnic minorities can't be qualified for higher education and top job positions? No, you troglodyte, I'm not saying that at all. Any member of any race can be qualified for any job. That's why I oppose race-based affirmative action. If you give everyone an equal playing field, that means no preferential treatment for any race, everyone starts out with the same resources and they have to get to the top on their own, then you see who really is qualified. You see who's the smartest. You see who's the hardest working. You see who's the most perseverant or the most resilient. Because do you know what an equal playing field looks like? It looks like considering everybody based on merit alone and not even giving a thought to the color of their skin. So if the people who reach the top happen to be black, then they happen to be black. If they happen to be white, then they happen to be white. If they happen to be Asian, Latino, Indian, Middle Eastern, then they happen to be whatever race they are. A meritocracy is a colorblind system, giving every individual the equal opportunity to succeed. Whether or not you achieve that success is the responsibility of the individual. If the outcome is unequal, you can't just look at that outcome, work backwards, and conclude that there must have been unequal opportunity to begin with. That kind of thinking is fallacious at best and dishonest at worst. And if you're going to try to force an equal outcome because you think that there was unequal opportunity, then the only one undermining equal opportunity is you. Equal opportunity is, by definition, free of intervention. If you're trying to tip the scales in favor of certain individuals or groups, then you give a disproportionate level of opportunity to those people. It is unequal. If you really wanted to help disadvantaged people get into college, then help people who are actually disadvantaged. Help people who can't afford college. 14.5% of Americans live below the poverty line, and those financial barriers virtually exclude that part of the population from getting into college. Not only do they not have access to quality primary and secondary education, but they also can't afford the ludicrous prices of College Board standardized testing, college admissions tutors, application fees, and most horrendous of all, the ever-soaring tuitions of most top colleges. The college admissions process has become a money-hungry racket, and this is stripping that 14.5% of any kind of opportunity for education and upward mobility. If you think affirmative action is really necessary to help disadvantaged people, then reform it so that it's based exclusively on class and income, so that it can target the American poor, provide them with those opportunities, and level the playing field. Don't award extra points on standardized tests, don't favor a poor person's application over a rich person's, just give them the financial means they need to attend college if they really are qualified to do so. And given that 27.4% of African Americans and 26.6% of Hispanics live below the poverty line compared to 9.9% of whites, chances are you'll end up benefiting a fair number of non-white people if that really is what you're going for. Don't give affirmative action to affluent minority families just because they're not white. Those families were probably able to send their kids to good elementary and high schools, while schools in impoverished Black and Hispanic communities are largely unable to prepare their students for competitive undergraduate programs, as evidenced by the significantly lower GPAs of Blacks and Hispanics when compared to whites and Asians. But reality, Weasel, affirmative action isn't about helping the poor, it's about undoing the systemic racism from centuries of oppression and discrimination against ethnic minorities. I find this argument totally unproductive. Maybe the ethnic minorities are disproportionately affected by poverty because of that discrimination in the past. I think that there's a case to be made for that. But unfortunately, you can't undo the past, you can only make the present better. And we don't live in a time where minorities are legally barred from educational opportunities. Talk about historic oppression and systemic racism until the cows come home, but at the end of the day, if you're poor, and in a capitalist economy, your wealth is the ultimate factor in determining your life conditions. The color of your skin couldn't be more irrelevant. Unfortunately, however, this isn't how college administrators think. 55% of bachelor's degrees are awarded to students who come from the top economic quartile, while only 9.4% are awarded to students from the bottom quartile. It also happens that with the advent of race-based affirmative action, the black-white gap in college enrollment is decreasing, but the income gap is increasing and is nearly double the racial divide. And even as that racial divide shrinks, we still get this most damning statistic. In 2009, 40% of white college students received a GPA of 3.5 or higher, while only 19.5% of Black students and 24.8% of Hispanic students met this benchmark. And I say most damning because this is the statistic that reveals the true intentions behind affirmative action. Race-based affirmative action isn't actually about helping disadvantaged students. If it were, then we'd see more economic diversity in those admission statistics. Nor is it about propelling qualified individuals into top universities. If it were, then I'd imagine those GPAs would be a bit higher. It's nothing more than an attempt to create a surface-level facade of diversity to appeal to the current cultural narrative that ethnic minorities are oppressed classes that need preferential treatment, and that having more minorities at your school is in itself a good thing, regardless of what the people in that diverse setting bring to the table. In short, universities want to admit minority students because they're minorities. Because they aren't white. It's one big, gigantic, institutional virtue signal. Diversity means inclusion, unless you're a white male. Diversity means the best treatment for everyone, unless you're a white male. Affirmative action isn't pro-minority, it's just anti-white. And it's all a symptom of the ever-growing progressive mindset that dominates our society. Whatever you want to call it, progressivism, radical leftism, social justice, it's an ideology of society-wide affirmative action. In progressive ideology, the quote-unquote oppressed classes of the West receive the benefits of social standing for no other reason than that they're ethnic minorities, or women, or gay. Their voices are given priority in cultural conversation. They're virtually immune from criticism because everyone's too afraid of being called a bigot. The oppressed become the virtuous, and the white man gets the short end of the stick. And it's all done in the name of equality, of trying to repent for the years of systemic oppression at the hands of their ancestors. You know who else thought like that? The Soviet Union. Korenizatsia's pragmatic basis was to preserve the unity of the USSR, but it was ultimately grounded in Marxist ideology. The Bolsheviks dreamed of a utopian world where everyone was equal, and to do that, they needed not only to abolish private property within their own borders, but also give benefits to the ethnic minorities that had been subjugated by the Russian Empire. What the social justice crowd calls oppression, the Bolsheviks called Russian chauvinism, and they were trying to undo the years of subjugation faced by ethnic minorities under the rule of the Romanovs. It's why so many minorities were given seats in the government. But do you know what the state did to those ethnic minorities in the end? It had them killed. During the Great Purge, Stalin accused the non-Russian officials of being hired agents intent on infiltrating the Soviet Union from without and dismantling it from within. According to Stalin, it was now the ethnic minorities who were oppressing the native Russians, and now that the minorities were the ones on top, they no longer needed preferential treatment. It was time that the Russians received their due justice. And so, in a stunning move of betrayal, Stalin denounced the non-Russian officials as quote-unquote bourgeois nationalists, had them sent to the gulags, and began a new process of Russification in the Union. As soon as the perfect classless society had been achieved, as soon as Russia had made up for its past mistakes, it no longer had any need for the ethnic minorities it had taken the trouble to assist in the first place, and business carried on as it had before. Kolonizacja turned out to be nothing more than a hollow, self-interested gesture of inclusion, using the ethnic minorities of the Russian Empire to prop up the Soviet Union's moral righteousness. The state did this multiple times with similar institutions. Take the Zhenotdel, the women's section of the Communist Party. The organization was created to combat the gender inequality that had persisted under the Romanovs. In the socialist utopia, women were to be afforded the same rights as any man. The Zhenotdel promoted women's rights within the Union for 11 years, but when Stalin decided that gender equality had been achieved, he had the Zhenotdel dissolved. The same thing happened to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which was formed during World War II to appease the Allied powers after Hitler broke the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, or JAC, was comprised of some of the most prominent Jewish intellectuals of the Soviet Union, assembled to demonstrate the absence of anti-Semitism within the Union. It published pro-Soviet propaganda during the war, but after the conflict had ended, Stalin turned around and accused many of the JAC's members of conspiracy in the so-called Jewish Doctors Plot, and had others killed in the event known as the Night of the Murdered Poets. The Soviet Union were the champions and defenders of all socially disadvantaged groups, but only as long as they were needed. The well-being of those groups didn't matter in the end. The important thing was that the state accomplished its goals. We're currently seeing the first inklings of this within the social justice movement, specifically in the way it's begun to treat the LGBT community. It seems to me that as soon as the Supreme Court ruled on nationwide marriage equality in the summer of 2015, the gay community got thrown under the bus by the authoritarian left. Sure, it made sense to stop talking about the fight for marriage equality. It was over and done with now. But what happened in the year following shows how despicable, shallow, and selfish progressives can be. 51 gay men were shot and killed in a nightclub in Orlando, and the progressive left refused to call out the attack as religiously inspired homophobia. Instead, they rushed to the defense of Muslims and cried out how Omar Mateen wasn't acting in the name of, quote, real Islam. Only 1 month later, a gay pride parade in Toronto was halted by Black Lives Matter. The BLM activists demanded more financial support for their own pet project and refused to budge until their demands were met. And now I've begun to see multiple headlines calling out the LGBT community for, you won't believe it, racism. Of all things. I think this headline sums it all up. No blacks is not a sexual preference. It's racism. Race, it appears, has now taken primacy over sexuality in the progressive hierarchy. The LGBT community is no longer a protected class. To these progressive leftists, the gay man is now as morally depraved as the run-of-the-mill straight white male. The gay community serves no purpose for the left anymore. The gays got the marriage equality they wanted, and more importantly, they did exactly what the left wanted them to do. They proved that the left was on the right side of history. And honestly, pitting tribe against tribe like this isn't even the worst part of this cultural form of affirmative action, in my opinion. It's the fact that there are tribes at all. That the social justice movement focuses on groups rather than individuals. Affirmative action denies individual agency. It invalidates individual accomplishments. It tells people that they're only as good or only as advantaged as the collective that they belong to. Imagine being an accomplished black man, an accomplished woman, an accomplished gay person, and being told that despite all your hard work, you're still inherently disadvantaged in society, and that you'll only truly succeed with empowerment from others. Imagine being an accomplished straight white male, and being told that your success is only a result of your societal privilege, and that you should give up some of your accomplishments for the greater good. It spits in the face of a free society, in which any person, regardless of the way they were born, can do anything and be the best at it. Affirmative action and the cultural attitude it reflects are condescending, controlling, and degrading to the human spirit. So don't believe a word of it. Rise above what they expect you to be.